In this tutorial, you're going to learn 6 reasons to stop performing the deep squat. This comes from a lot of social media that talks about how good it is for the human body, and in some respects it is. We'll discuss that, but what we're also going to do is dispel some of the myths and look at some of the anatomy that will help you understand that the deep squat is no more or less functional than any other type of squat. It just depends on the anatomy that you've got. The first reason I'm going to term bone length, which is determined by your genetics, and it's going to include ankle range of movement, tibia length, femur length, torso length. So tibia length is this bone here. Femur length is obviously that bone there, and then torso length is that structure there. Obviously ankle range of movement is the ankle down here. So I'm going to try and quickly do a whistle stop tour of all 4 of these points and how they influence how you squat. So if we start with ankle range of movement. So as a precursor to all of these, the main function of the body is to stay sort of upright. So it doesn't want to fall over is what I mean by that. So how far your knee can come forward will determine your center of gravity. If your knee stays further back, your hips will stay back and you will be more likely to fall backwards with an upright torso. As your knee comes forward, your center of gravity comes forward, which allows your torso to stay upright. So your ankle range of movement is going to influence how far down you can squat. Now, I'm saying this whilst we maintain that neutral posture. Now, this is different if you are loading in a squat or if it is body weight. If you are body weight, you are able to round your spine because of the reduced load on the spine. You don't want to load your spine, you don't want to round your spine if you are loading it in a squat or a deadlift, etc., etc. So there are some caveats that come with this, and I'll try and get those in, but what I don't want to do is take too long in explaining all of this. So ankle range of movement, if your knee can come forward and you have greater range of movement, you are more likely to be able to keep your body upright, and then you are more likely to be able to get down further whilst maintaining this neutral spine. If we then look at tibia length, so if we've got adequate range of movement, so we test the range of movement of the ankle and we've got adequate there, but what we find is we've got a really long tibia, for example. Now obviously I'm exaggerating, you can see now it comes right in front of the toes, but if we've got a shorter tibia we might find it lines up with the toes. So again, that's going to influence how far our knee can come forward. So we've got to understand that it's not only the ankle, it's also the length of the tibia that is going to influence the center of gravity, which is going to influence whether we stay up on our feet or not. Then we come on to femur length. Now, it's well known that people with a shorter femur can squat deeper, and they can squat deeper with a neutral spine. And as you can see in this image, it's representing that. So what we've got, again, is it's bringing the center of gravity. So if we look at the hips, look how far behind the heels it is. But here, it's not that far. So you can see the influence that that is going to have on how far down you can squat with that neutral posture. And then the final one is torso length. So we've got a long torso is going to create, again, the head further forward, which again is going to influence where the center of gravity sits, which is then going to influence where the or how the body is going to organize itself with regards to the deep squat. So we have to first understand this, because this is just one influence that I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about the next 5 in the next 5 slides. The second reason is if your knees collapse in as you go into the squat, because it's doing a number of things. It's increasing unnecessary shear forces on the knee, and I'll explain that in a second. It creates muscle imbalances through the adductors and psoas, and also disengages gluteal muscles. So a valgus knee, which is the knee dropping in, is where the knee lines up to the inside of the foot. And as you squat down, your knees drop inwards. What's much more effective is if the knees push outwards, because you engage the muscles of the hip, which stabilize the pelvis and stabilize the knee, and you reduce the shear forces, and the shear forces are essentially sideways movements. So what it's basically saying is if you've got the shin bone here and the thigh bone here, the shear force is a sideways movement. So what can happen is the thigh bone, now obviously it's not going to do this because it's got ligaments and tendons and muscles that are holding it in place, but the forces want to drop this thigh bone off the side or off the inside of the shin bone. So it's creating those extra forces, putting pressure on those ligaments, tendons and muscles to hold that bone in place. This then starts creating these muscle imbalances on the inside and the outside of the hip. What's much more effective is when we go down into these squats, be it a parallel squat, a half squat, or even a deep squat, is to maintain the knees to the outside of the feet, because essentially the opposite is happening. What's happening is on the knee, it's staying neutral and the forces are going down through the knee rather than off to one side. The muscles on the outside and the inside of the leg are becoming more balanced. What's also happening in here is it's stabilizing the hip joint. As I've mentioned over here, obviously it unstabilizes it. So what we need to be able to do is create that position. Now that might mean because we've got muscle tightness, but it might also mean that we haven't got adequate range of movement at the ankle. So what the body will do to be able to get the knee further forward, if the ankle can't do it, it will collapse the foot, which will drop the knee in and then create it. So there's a little bit of a process of deduction to be able to go through to be able to find out what is actually causing the problems as to why you can't maintain the proper biomechanics into a deep squat. So what we have to do is we have to understand that. Is it shin length? Is it femur length? Is it torso length? Is it ankle range of movement? Is it muscle imbalances in through here? So it's trying to piece all of this together rather than just going, a deep squat is more functional than a quarter squat or a half squat. You should be doing a deep squat and not a half squat. Is that the case for your body? This is the process that you need to go through to be able to learn that and then to be able to apply it as to whether a deep squat is going to be effective and functional for you, rather than just believing that it's a functional exercise and I should be able to do it. Reason number 3 is the hip wink. So this is where you'll see someone go down into a squat and then there's a little tuck of the hip as it goes under. Now what this is doing, this is affecting the L5, S1 segment of the spine, so right at the base of the spine. It is a mechanism for disc bulge and disc herniation. Now that doesn't mean that the first time that you do it, it's going to create that problem. You probably don't feel any pain when it happens, but over time, it eventually starts moving you towards and being a contributing factor to a disc bulge and herniation. So in the moment, you won't necessarily feel anything and you'll just assume that you can go down as deep as you're going. Again, this third bullet point comes down to load. So as you increase the load, you increase the problem. So if you've got a big heavy bar like this one, and you've got a hip wink, that is going to speed up the mechanism of disc bulge and disc herniation. If you're in a body weight full squat and your hip winks or your back rounds, then there is much less load, so there is much less likelihood of the mechanism of disc bulge and disc herniation. If you have a spine that is more predisposed to disc bulge and disc herniation, then that process just isn't going to move as fast as if it's a heavy load like that. So hopefully what you can start to see as you're working through this is there are different mechanisms and different variables that you need to think about when it comes to just going into a deep squat, because it's not, as I've mentioned through all of this, and I'll keep mentioning it because I see it so much on social media about, oh, you've got to be able to deep squat is the most functional, deep squat's this, deep squat's that, ass to grass this, ass to grass that. If your body is suited to that and you are able to do that and you have the proper mechanics for it, then by all means go and do it. And you're doing it in the right way, which is if you haven't got the best biomechanics but you're doing it as body weight, then it's more effective. But if you haven't got the proper mechanics and you're doing it with load, then it's going to turn and speed up a problem. So we have to be a little bit more intelligent with the ideas that we're bringing to our exercise and our movement as a whole. Reason 4 is a rounded spine. So you can see now it's much more this position rather than just a little hip tuck. So what is now happening is it's starting to now, or the problem now is starting to affect further up the spine. So we've got L5S1 and L4L5. Now this has the potential to go higher as well. Again, it's the mechanism for disc bulge, disc herniation. Again, if you're more predisposed to it because of the type of discs or the type of spine that you have, then that process is going to be speeded up. And that process is also going to be speeded up if load is involved. If it's body weight, it's going to be it's going to slow that process down. And again, increase of load increases the problem. And what I'm also going to talk about later, which I've also discussed so far, is foot position. And that again is going to play its role in ankle range of movement, valgus knee, hip stability, center of gravity, and the ability to maintain that neutral spine that we want to be able to do during the deep squat. Reason number 5 is hip joint structure. Now this is something that's being talked about a little bit more. So we've got deep sockets versus shallow sockets, and then you've got femoral neck angle and you've got hip socket angle. So what you can see here is deep hip socket. That means you're more prone to be able to only really do shallower squats, and shallower hip sockets will allow you to deep squat. What we've then got is femoral neck angle. So what the femoral neck angle, you've got the femur, which is the thigh bone, and then you've got the ball on the end. So you can have angles of here and here. So sort of 90 degrees, 120 degrees, so on and so forth. The final one is hip socket angle, which you can see just about on here. So you've got a much more sort of hip socket angle coming forward and hip socket angle coming more towards the side of the pelvis. And again, this is going to change the mechanics. This is, if you then combine this with femur length, hip length, femur length, tibia length, ankle range of movement, torso length, it's all going to have its influence on how you can squat. And as I've mentioned, deeper hip sockets are better for shallower squats and not so good for deep squats, and shallow hip sockets are much better for deeper squatting. Now, again, most people won't know the angle of their hip. So unless you can understand that, from this perspective, if you've got a shallow hip socket, then go for it, and you can deep squat. But what you have to be mindful of is, are you going into valgus knee? Do you have adequate ankle range of movement to go with it? So on and so forth. So it's not just as simple as going, well, I've got a shallow hip socket, I'm therefore going to do it. And I can do it. You can do it from a hip socket perspective, but what about the length of bones, and what about the ankle range of movement and the muscle balance between gluteal and psoas and adductor? So there's just a lot of things to think about, which is kind of my point. So it's not just a case of going, well, Dave on social media says it's okay to do, therefore I'm going to do it. Or you've got a guy with some flash muscles in a nice short pair of shorts doing some deep squats, telling you that it's the greatest exercise in the world. Whereas for him it may be, because he's got the biomechanics to be able to do it, but yourself may not. So it's just to think about it a little bit more and just not jump into something that is potentially going to cause you a problem. The final reason is foot position. So you've got parallel feet, toes out. So some people say you've got to have parallel feet. Some people say you've got to have your toes out. Some people say you can have your toes out this far or that far, or they should only go this far. Again, it will depend, and it will depend on a few things. It will depend on hip anatomy. So the hip anatomy will determine that. Range of movement of the ankle will determine that. Because you see people in the weightlifting shoes, and all the weightlifting shoes are allowing to happen is so the ankle doesn't move as much. So if you haven't got adequate ankle range of movement and you put your foot up on a wedge, your body will stay more upright, but your ankles won't move as much. As you put your heel on the floor, you are then asking your ankle to try and move more to be able to keep your torso upright. So what it's basically saying, it's allowing you to squat, but not with proper ankles, if that makes sense. So now, is that down to the design of your ankle? Is that down to the design of the femur length, the tibia length or the femur length? Or is that just down to simple, I've got tight ankles and I can't get far enough? And also, does your goal require you to have a deep squat? If that makes sense, because I do find that people say they need these weightlifting shoes to get down deeper, but when you ask them about their goals, it really doesn't matter, because their goal's not really based on needing to be able to get down that far and activating certain muscles and so on and so forth. So again, there's a lot of stuff that it depends on, and as I've mentioned, if you haven't got adequate ankle range of movement, what's going to happen is your knee is going to dump inwards. That's going to collapse your foot. Your obviously knee's going to drop inwards, foot's going to collapse, toes then are going to go out. So then you might think, well, I need to put my toes out. That could sort of help the symptom, but it won't help the cause, which is poor ankle range of movement or different mechanics of limb length, so on and so forth. So there are a lot of pieces that need to go together to be able to understand whether your body is suited to deep squats, which is the whole point of this video. Because again, as I've mentioned, there are a lot of social media influencers, as they're called these days, that are out there saying deep squat is the best way to squat. It does this, it does that, it's more functional, so on and so forth, using all these buzzwords. And then people go, oh, that must be right because, you know, they're saying it. And unfortunately, what they're not doing is going into, okay, well, if deep squat is the thing to do, let's understand your body well enough to see if your body is able to do that adequately, so it's not going to cause any potential problems in the future. So hopefully this video or tutorial or workshop has opened your eyes to that, which is really the main aim, because there's obviously a lot of detail in it. I've just tried to show you these variables and reasons. But if you can understand it a little bit more, you should be able to gain a better understanding of whether the deep squat is suitable for you, and whether Dave on social media is saying or actually knows what he's talking about, if that makes sense. So many thanks for watching. My name's Chris. I will speak to you in the next tutorial.